on liberals and free trade. Duncan tells me the free trade, removal of barriers to international trade in goods and services played a critical role in British politics in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Attitudes to free trade helped define parties' position on political spectrum. For much of its life, the fortunes of the Liberal Party were closely tied to the strength of popular feeling for free trade. More recently, it has been something debate, but thanks to Brexit and President Trump, trade and tariffs are back very high on the political agenda. We're going to talk about that this evening with the help of Professor Frank Trentmann on my right and Lord Chris Fox on my left, the Liberal Democrat spokesman on business and trade. We were to have Julie Smith, Lady Smith, chairing tonight, but unfortunately she's unwell and was unable to come, so I'm afraid to number with me. Right, Frank is going to speak first, and I'm going to introduce, but I'm also going to introduce Chris, so we can move straight from Frank's contribution to Chris. Frank Trentmann is a professor of history at Birkbeck College, University of London, a historian of modern Britain, Germany, and the world. His work explores the interplay between material, political, and moral transformations, as you'll see from books that he's written about consumer culture, energy and water, everyday life, trade and political economy. In addition to academic audiences, his research has engaged with a wide range of groups and stakeholders, from government ministries to school children, companies and consumers, museums, media, and visual artists. His book include Empire of Things, How We Became a World of Consumers, and the very good Free Trade, Nation, Consumption, and Civil Society. He has also just published last year a book on post-war recovery of Germany called Out of the Dark. Oh, sorry. Yes. Chris Fox is the Liberal Democrat spokesman for business and trade in the House of Lords. He has a long track record in a range of businesses, including petroleum, nuclear, food, automotives, aerospace, and was even chief executive of the Liberal Democrat from 2009 to 2011, which covered the 2010 election and the first part of the British coalition. He became a peer in 2014 and is a past member of the Science and Technology and Economic Affairs, and now sits on the International Agreements Committee.
For the invitation, and congratulations on the Liberal History Group for excellent timing and scheduling. As we sit here, if we just sort of recall the last 2 weeks, we had tariff threats from the President of the United States over European critique of his plans to annex Greenland. We had the EU threatening a tariff war. We had the negotiations about Mercosur, a large free trade agreement with mainly Latin American countries. And today, we have a free trade agreement between India and the European Union successfully concluded. So trade definitely is back on the agenda. But unfortunately, most of the news have, if you are a liberal and free trader, they've been bad news. So we've seen a number of tariff wars. We have what many commentators view as an era of deglobalization. We have new regional economic zones that are being formed. Now, I'm a historian, not an economist or a policy advisor, but I do believe it is helpful to try and place recent developments a little bit in a longer perspective, partly to figure out what's different and what's the same, and to help one think about how one might respond politically to the current malaise and growing disorder. So what are we seeing really in the last few years? Are we seeing, as some commentators always like to emphasize, a return to late 19th century neo-mercantilism, the era of new imperialism, tariff wars? Or are we seeing effectively a normalization where the highly unusual post-45 international order, which we got used to, is now falling apart, but we're returning to a more normal state where, well, countries just use tariffs for a number of reasons. So that's what I will try to examine a little bit. Now, the first thing that's striking, if you look at Donald Trump and the way he presented his tariffs, is the considerable similarity to what Joseph Chamberlain came up with in 1903, which is effectively a sort of three-pronged attack. The idea that tariffs secure domestic employment, so speaking to the workers, that they raise revenue, good for the state, and they give you geopolitical strategic power. Now, as with Joseph Chamberlain, the sad truth, of course, is you can't have all these three things at once. If you want to increase revenue, that is incompatible with having high tariffs that keep foreign goods out. If they're kept out, then you don't collect revenue. So there are a number of similarities, including the incoherence from a purely logical point of view, but that didn't stop Trump, nor at the time did it stop Chamberlain from pushing the issue. Now, the big difference is that then, so in the years around 1900, unlike today, or Britain in particular, but also other countries, could fall back and develop and cultivate a very strong cross-political, cross-class, and cross-gender alliance, which contained and defeated these so-called tariff reform crusade that Chamberlain was trying to launch. Now, this was not just, it was particularly pronounced in Britain, but if you take a broader comparative view, this is quite striking that in imperial Germany before 1914, you also have considerable popular support for free trade, not just among liberals, but also in the Social Democratic Party, people like Bernstein, one of the leaders of the SPD. You have some mass protests over food tariffs, in the German case, over meat and the rising price of meat. In Italy and other countries, you have liberal networks. You have the whole transnational network of Cobden clubs, very active in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, if you fast forward to this year and last year, I think the surprising thing is how little in terms of popular protest there has been. Yes, you can read The Economist and the Financial Times and have commentary on the evils of tariffs. But if you step outside government ministries or certain business associations, there isn't that much said. And I checked just to make sure, the historians, we like to be on firm ground, or at least the good ones. And in the protests, so-called No More Kings protests in hundreds of cities in the United States, where you had older forms of political agitation with song and dance, there was only one. I went through the sort of song sheets. There was only one song that even referred to the evil of tariffs, And that was copying an old Bob Marley song, Who Shot the Sheriff? And people were asked to sing Don, Donald Trump, Don got the tariffs, now he's shot the whole economy. Which is perhaps an exaggeration if you look back. But that's sort of an isolated instance. So the big question, I think, is where did all this energy go? And what does this tell us? And so if we go to the heartland of free trade culture and politics in the years before the First World War, there you have the coming together or stacking up of a number of cases in support for free trade. There's, first of all, the obvious economic case. So free trade, supposedly, or liberals said and radicals said, guarantees cheapness, cheap food, the cheap loaf, and it allows you to stay competitive because cheap raw materials will give British manufacturing and exports the upper hand. But then you have a political case, which is about the development of democracy, legitimacy, legitimate rule, and accountability. And that was partly based on the idea of sound finance. So free trade stops politicians from coming up with mad schemes, which at the end the taxpayer pays. But it's also about inclusion and equality. People at the time, in the Edwardian period, the term they used is that free trade would defend the purity of politics. And what they meant by this was that the minute you introduce tariffs, you open the door to vested special interest lobbies who then behind the scenes try to influence government at the expense of the general public. Looking around the room, it's, I think, worth stressing that this argument particularly appealed also to women, and liberal free trade women's movements were an important part of the free trade revival. And their argument was, we don't have the vote, we want the vote, we want the suffrage, and there is a kind of symmetry between the economic case of the individual consumer making wise choices in the marketplace and the citizen who every 4 years is asked to make a choice on a ballot ticking a box. And their argument was that as housewives, we are, in the first case, the consumers who benefit from cheap articles. If we can go out into the market and compare, I don't know, apples from the stall run by Smith with the apples by Miller to identify what's really the best choice. If we can do that day in and day out, surely every 4 years we're capable of ticking a box, selecting our candidate for parliament. So the idea was that free trade more generally socialized people into citizenship, making them aware of having to pursue choices and thinking about the consequences. That's the political case. Then you have the international case, the so-called douceur of commerce, how trade polishes and softens people, and instead of violent interactions, because it creates commercial relationships across cultures, across regions in the world, which tie us together. And trade, after all, you know, I want your goods, means I don't shoot you. I want to trade with you. So I develop relationships, and the idea is that over time, we then, we don't become the same, but we come to tolerate each other and resort to peaceful forms of interaction. And in the British case, all of this received its strength through a particular narrative that appealed to Britain's national identity as champions of liberty, progress, emancipation, in which the so-called Hungry 40s gave way through the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, opened the gates towards an ever more liberal, ever more civilized society. So those are the sort of the building blocks. Now, how does it all fall apart? Now, the policy itself really falls apart in 1931 in the world recession, when even Keynes comes around and says, okay, perhaps in the circumstances, a tariff is better than sticking to free trade. But that retreat on the ground of policy is only sort of one stage in the gradual sort of erosion or falling apart of the building blocks that had held up free trade. So cheapness, the promise that free trade guarantees cheapness. Well, free trade Britain in the course of the First World War suffers, like almost all competent countries, from massive inflation. So if you're a housewife by 1918, and you see the sort of explosion of the price of milk and other items, you think, well, cheapness doesn't seem to guarantee cheapness. Perhaps we need some form of regulation or interference with the market. Similarly, peace. The big argument before the First World War was that free trade fosters harmonious international relations. And a man called Norman Angell, Nobel Prize, later Nobel Peace Prize winner, wrote a bestseller selling hundreds of thousands of copies, where he said it's a great illusion to believe that countries, industrial countries, Germany and Britain, which are the closest trading partners, would win anything economically from going to war. Hence, once we show that this is just an illusion, peace will be secure. Mass movement. Well, it didn't stop the declaration of war in August 1914. So at the end of the First World War, many free traders sort of amended their previous sort of more laissez-faire model to amend it with forms of international coordination, be it the League of Nations or ideas of large corporations coming together in some coordinate economic life. After 1945, this, I think, shifting of political energy away from public life more generally to more experts and discrete stakeholders continues. So GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and then the WTO, the World Trade Organization, they're not exactly populist arenas. They're often, in fact, accused of eating behind doors and not being undemocratic. So trade moves away from or out of the main public space. And as far as the democratic attraction of free trade is concerned, what we, of course, see in the course of the 20th century is the expansion of social democracy or the social state, in which the state just assumes far larger responsibility for not just for the economic life, but also for social security through legislation on minimum wages, social benefits, and pensions. So the old free trade argument, which used the cheap loaf, but was never just about prices. So if you look at the posters and cartoons free traders had, they often just used the cheap loaf, and then next to it they said, look at the wages in Germany, so much lower than the wages in Britain, which are much higher. So the argument was really that free trade was the guarantor of a good or high standard of living and high real wages. These days, free trade is really about the price of this or price of that, but your real wages are determined by many, many, many other factors. So the state expansion has something to answer for it. So what we then see after 45 is, yes, we see renewed globalization and a lowering of tariffs, but it happens at a political or a policy level, which is dislodged from general or more popular politics. There's some groups who still champion free trade openly and strongly. Sometimes sort of not people you would suspect, like Che Guevara. Che Guevara gives big speeches on free trade and how really the battle for decolonization and the fight against empire is also a fight against tariffs. And he wants people to have access to free trade as a right, as a human right. But then he and other anti-imperial fighters will add, but once we are free as independent countries, then we must have the chance to build up our own development, protect our own agriculture, have infant industry protection. So it's a sort of lukewarm commitment, I would say. Intellectually and politically, it's, you know, they're networks of Christian groups who try and keep the gospel of free trade flying. But even they, in the sort of 1950s, 1960s, look back on the Second World War and come to the conclusion, well, it's really the European community, now it's the European Union, that's the best answer against war. And as you know, the European Union, while it's internally a free trade zone, is externally not exactly a free trade zone. So there are many compromises. So to conclude, what does this mean? Well, I think one can sort of summarize what I told you into a fairly simple argument, which is that in the literature, economic literature, policy literature, but also the commentary we have on tariffs, a lot of attention is always on the strength of the tariffs. Tariffs have it easier because they benefit a quite small number of people heavily. Yeah, so the auto industry, if you get tariffs, the auto industry is pleased, and they are concentrated interest. The public interest is very diffuse. You know, I don't know, your cousin might work in the auto industry, but the other cousins might be in the service sector, and yet others might be at university. So they don't have that shared interest. So the theory of collective interest is very good, I think, in explaining why tariffs work fairly easily in politics. But what I think is missing from this analysis is the falling away or the growing weakness of the free trade opposition. So one reason why we have all this tariffs and talk of tariff wars, you know, from the EU or European countries just think, oh, then we hit back. One reason why this is possible is that the opponent has shrunk or gone away. So it's really as much about, I think, about the withering of free trade as a powerful political opponent, which has allowed tariffs to rise. And it's particularly, I think, noticeable if you look at the role of consumers. It's not that I stand on Hungerford Bridge every day, but whenever I come into town, I never see any mass demonstrations of consumers with posters saying tariffs are equal, tariffs are equal. Where are these consumers? Well, the consumers themselves have become much more divided in contemporary history compared to the consumers that Asquith and Lloyd George and Gladstone and Cobden would appeal to. These days, consumer politics is fragmented. There's ethical consumers, there's environmental consumers, there's animal welfare consumers, there's people concerned about local food, but they do not have a shared joint movement. And if you look at the international level, Consumers International, which brings the different consumer groups in across the world together, is a very weak umbrella, because consumers in India or Malaysia and other places don't see the market, don't see trade as consumers in Manchester or Glasgow. So the cultural and political space of free trade has shrunk. Now that's a sort of sad thing. So I should try and offer a glimpse, at least of hope. On the one hand, this means we have a much, if you care about free trade, it's a much bigger uphill struggle, I think, now than it was 120 years ago. But there's also opportunity. And I think the opportunity lies in the democratic idea, the democratic argument that supported free trade and that warned of tariffs as concentrations of power. It's ultimately an argument against authoritarian rule, against monopoly rule, and against the ruling parties enriching themselves at the expense of the public. That, I think, is the card one should play. And with the view of what's going on in Washington, I think it's a good card to play. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and good evening to the people online as well. It's great that you were able to join us. I'm afraid I'm the product of a more or less history-free education. Because I took chemistry and German, I didn't take history. So I'm afraid, well, good news is that nothing I'm going to say really replicates what the professor said, which may be bad news for me because it may be wrong. But I must say I was fascinated. I hadn't thought of historians going for songbooks, and I do think that there is a treasure trove of liberal glee club songbooks sitting there, perhaps, that some of you ought to go through to see what our free trade position was in songs that have been sung at liberal conferences over the years. Well, while assessing the recent India-UK free trade agreement, as part of the International Agreements Committee, which is the only body, and I'll explain that later, that scrutinizes free trade agreements in Parliament. One witness said, trade is increasingly embedded in geopolitical strategy and shaped by shifting alliances and strategic calculus. That is a glorious and cogent understatement of where we are now. So I'm going to try and set out in a more political rather than historical sense the complications and contradictions of modern trade that create difficult political choices. And I've refrained from a detailed analysis of the Trump onslaught, not least because it's like catching a falling knife, but also you're watching it as well as I do. My description of it is going to be no better or worse than your description of it. I think if we have discussions, we can talk about it. But there's one point I'd like to make about Trump, and then I won't put him down. And as we heard from the professor, free trade was seen as a weapon against poverty, and at first domestic low. And of course, the attack on Joseph J was the stomach tax, the attack on his parent policies. But then we moved on domestically to internationally, and the whole idea of a rise of votes and the whole idea of trade bringing everybody up. So we believe that trade is good for people, a weapon against poverty. However, what Trump applies is a growing view that free trade is practiced today with domestic poverty, not a fight against it. That's been the political weapon that has been deployed. Now, I would say that there's another important issue here, and it's really important when you're talking about trade, think about competition policy. Because since the 80s in particular, the major issue over the application of competition policy has been the consumer prices based around the production. And what that has meant is the competition policy has allowed competitor after competitor after competitor to aggregate within a national market. And ultimately, there being one producer, let's say, of roller skates in Wisconsin, then it becomes even more efficient to produce those roller skates somewhere in China. So the exporting of those jobs is made ever more easy, not least by China's accession to most favored nation at the time, but also the fact that competition policy had only used consumer prices as the metric by which mergers and acquisitions measured. And I believe that made the stripping of manufacturing jobs out of developed nations much easier to do. Consumers got cheap stuff, but many of them lost their manufacturing jobs. And in America, many of these became Trump's people. So in a sense, the gauntlet's put down in the 80s when the whole Chicago approach to economics really swept in. So that's a personal opinion, but I think it's important for us to think about it. But so in a sense, we've talked a little bit about the World Trade Organization, not much, and I don't want to go into it, but there has been a global tide running against the WTO for it. And clearly it's been fueled by a whole bunch of stresses. Stress of China and what the Chinese rise is doing, the institutional erosion of COVID, and of course shocks in things like Ukraine, hostilities or Russian hostilities in Ukraine, name three. But now, in a sense, the tide has turned into a demolition crew, and I'm not really talking about the east wing of the White House. There is, the knives are out, and I think it is really that the WTO is even thinking about whether it might be the pay, which is very shocking. Now, I'm sure many of you have studied it, but speaking at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, Canadian Premier Mark Carney declared that the old world order was in the midst of rupture and was not coming back. So before mass panic sets in around us, I thought we could hold those words, relax, and then talk a little bit about UK domestic trade policy and practice. Now I'm treading a little on thin ice here. I feel the presence of an academic. But I did want to think about how trade has evolved, and the professor really talked about it in a much better way. But my simplistic view that free trade was about how it was about goods within a gold standard world economy to start with, which reduced currency risk, and trade expansion was clearly driven not just by politics but by steams, railways, and things like that. Contemporary free trade agreements still seem obviously to remove or reduce tariffs, but the role of non-tariff barriers is a major concern in any deal. In fact, if you look at a free trade agreement, it's mostly about that. It's very little about tariffs, because they're part of the done deal on the start. And often, trade negotiations trying to extend FTAs into services, investment, and increasingly data and localization. Now, so today's free trade operates within mostly flexible exchange rates, large and volatile capital flows, and complex value chains, interacting with monetary policy, financial regulation, competition policy, public procurement rules, and subsidy regulation as a starter. Furthermore, today's trade debates tend to focus less on, as I've said, on headline tariffs and more on issues like regulatory alignment, standards, subsidies, the role of state-owned enterprises, human and workers' rights, environmental policy, agricultural practice, rules of origin, mutual recognition of professional qualifications, data localization, visas, student fees, and that's just to name a few. So, and I want to pull one out with special attention, which is ISDS. Investor state dispute settlements are rules through which sovereign states can be sued by foreign investors for certain state actions that affect the value of foreign direct investment made by the investment. As of June 2024, over $113 billion to be paid by states to investors under ISDS. The vast majority of these is with money going to fossil fuel interests that have been impaired in public policy. So an FTA may well include an agreement that addresses issues relevant to cross-border investments, usually for the purpose of protection, promotion, and liberalization of said investments. They may or they may not include an arrangement for ISDS. For example, the UK-Indian one does not ISDS. Now, depending on the country with whom we're negotiating, the UK has both pushed for and resisted inclusion of ISDS. This has been the same under Labour and Conservative governments. Now, as Lib Dems, we've often spoken against big business reaching into public policy. And I think that's right. But we should also do that in the knowledge that with no mutual ISDS, UK investment in another country could and is devalued by public policy without recourse. That's just one example. Further complications when we talk about free trade. Self-evidently, the scope, instruments, and governance of free trade change from the basic idea of reducing tariff barriers. Negotiations only reach successful conclusion with concessions from both sides. Something will always have to be sacrificed in order to get something else. As such, opposition parties can always find a problem with any deal. We know that because we've done it. There's always something wrong with the deal that's part of a deal. That's politics. Now, but if we were leading the negotiation of a new deal, what would be our red line? And realistically, would we have so many red lines? It's so overwhelming that we'd never, ever do a trade deal. So it's not simple. The process of negotiating and deciding what you want can scupper the deal in the first place. But the other major point I want to make is the absence of meaningful parliamentary oversight. The power to negotiate treaties such as FTAs in the UK is vested in the government under the royal authority. That negotiation is carried out in secret and usually largely in isolation from industrial and business strategy, competition policy, and international development. No pre-negotiation mandate is issued by the government before it starts the process of negotiation. Only constraint on this happens at the conclusion of the negotiations under CRAG, the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, brought in before then, but it came to an enactment in 2010. This process offers little more than the famous Ponsonby Rule that dates back to the 1920s. We still have a Ponsonby in the House of Lords. CRAG requires that the government lay a treaty before Parliament for 21 sitting days before it can be ratified. If the Lords adopts a motion that the treaty should not be ratified, it can be swept aside by the government. However, if the House of Commons has resolved against ratification, the government must wait a further 21 days before it can ratify the treaty, relay the treaty. In theory, this could be repeated ad infinitum and allow the House of Commons to delay ratification infinitely. In practice, the House of Commons has never voted against ratification. I would say that in some cases, this is because the government actually denies the opposition debating time to even have a debate on the free trade agreement at all. And in the House of Lords, we've rejected ratification only once, and that was not a trade deal. In general, the only scrutiny comes from the Lords International Agreements Committee, on which until an hour ago I sat, and I just rotated on. So the Indian UK free trade agreement, my swan song, and my view on that, this is less to the eye, but we can have that discussion another time. So the IAC, as we call it, helps to inform the debate, but this all has to be done within 21 days. The evidence has to be taken. The report has to be written. It has to be laid before the House of Lords in time for it to have a debate before the 21 working days is over. It is quite simply insufficient. And if anybody wants to read a report, we did a report on the inadequacy process. There's much more detail. Furthermore, the point that many of us would feel devolved parliaments in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland have legitimate interest, particularly in things like agriculture, internal markets, public procurement, and they have no control at all. So you've all been really quite tolerant. There's been no heckling. I was expecting some. I'm very disappointed. The geopolitical order may well be in the middle of Carney's midst of rupture, and it may well not be coming back. The multilateral rules are quite clearly under huge threat. Trump is taking it to another level of threat. Yet, the India-UK FTA was concluded under WTO. So those rules are still working out, even if the organisation itself is not functioning. In the UK, these deals should, in the future, looking forward, the trade deals should be better tied in with domestic industrial and business strategy. We should have more to sell than cheap and risky and a few cars. There is no indication that of whether a negotiator has worked with the industrial development side and to look at what the future market might be based on the future industrial strategy. I don't think that happens. With competition policy, as I've already over-egged, there has to be an approach that more than consumer prices. There has to be a thought about capacity. There has to be a thought about the supply chain, things like that as well. And that will tend to how much you give away, how much you see. And it needs to be integrated with international development programs. We haven't talked much about development. It's another huge element of trade, least developed countries and how they're treated, all this kind of stuff. Coming back to the Indian trade is really interesting because it will, the textiles part of that agreement will displace development trade that we have in Bangladesh and Pakistan. Now that has to be factored in by the government, it's factored in by the committee. Just sitting on because I insisted on here. So each deal with one country has a knock-on effect of trade with other countries. In some of those countries, least developed countries, then there will be detrimental effect of development going on out there. So it's pretty complicated. So to track this, government should set up a negotiating strategy for work start. Should come to Parliament with on-the-record updates like they did and they do in Europe. And parliamentarians should use this to drive an integrated approach to negotiation. There should be explicit powers. And as part of it, I think looking forward, we have to work harder to understand the complexity of trade and its effect on our economy and our society. It's easy for us to say we believe in trade, but I hope that the one thing you take from here, question mark, what is free trade? Because there is a lot to think about when we're sitting down with a free trade agreement. And that should, I think, that thought, those things going forward, should help to guide us where our red line would be in the event that we were actually sitting about what negotiating agreement. That's the process. That's the process what's important. And here I'm coming back to the bigger picture of multilateralism, which I believe should be our focus. Coming back to Mark Carney, I told you to come back. He made a telling point into which we could easily substitute the word Canada with United Kingdom. I would tell you that the other countries, especially intermediate powers like Canada, are not powerless. They have the capacity to build a new order that encompasses our values, such as respect for human rights, sustainable development, solidarity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the various states. Now, I think Liberal Democrats can join, should join the Liberals across Europe, Canada, and elsewhere. And if we pick up that banner with other like-minded parties, then I think we can stay.
Now, I'm sure you've got lots of questions for both of our speakers, but before we get to those, I'm going to ask Duncan to do a commercial.
Just in case there are any people here who are not actually already subscribers to Journal of the Wall Street, just a few quick words about what we do. The history group was set up in 1988 as part of Democrats were founded. And our aim is to encourage discussion and research on the histories of the Democrats, our predecessor parties. And we do this in four main ways. First, we're as like this one. And as Tony said, you're at GM. Our next one will be the spring conference in York. March on Liberals government. Will be Birmingham in the 1870s. So Joe Chamberlain already went wrong. And E.D. Simon and colleagues in Manchester in the 30s. And then we'll have another meeting in the NLC in summer, and then secondly, we publish a journal history. This issue. If you're a print subscriber, you should have that in place in the last days. Digital subscriber, we send them up on the website. And it's a quarterly subscribe rather frequently for compliance. Next issue will be we have an increasing number of articles and local news and meeting reports. And our next special edition is again thirdly, we issue a range of booklets in the autumn conference. We would see us launch our latest one, liberalism, precise guide to ideology, the historical currents that went together, philosophy. And we also have other concise booklets, specifically history, concise something on parties and what greatest achievements by the governments. And finally, we take a website, but also information. And given it's like giving again use.
Anyone who wants to do that, come and see us at the end of the meeting. But before then, an additional commercial at the back of the room, the NLC is running a book sale. If anybody would like to buy books, didn't get a chance before the meeting, I'm sure Derek would be happy to see you at the end of the meeting.
Is there still a chance to buy the beverage book on where he discusses to tariff or not to tariff? As I think following this, someone must. There it is.
And one final plea from me, if anybody hasn't signed in yet, please do so. This list here, thank the others circulating around the room, but we do like to get a record of the and we'll get the online from the book. So it's over to you now for questions. I'm going to take questions in the room first, using the microphone held by Paul, and then we'll take questions from online. And if you want to ask a question online, could please put it in the chat and Duncan will pick it up. So
thank you. Can I make a quick point and a quick question? I was glad you brought up Norman Angell, which might be interesting to the president, because as I'm sure you all remember, Norman Angell, great vision was that war wouldn't make sense anymore, economic sense, so we wouldn't have it. But unfortunately, they postponed, they wouldn't give him his Peace Prize on time because some people objected. So the next year they had to have two Peace Prizes. There's 33 and the 34, both came in 34. It was Henderson, the British politician, got it as well. So he might want to look up his Norman Angell. But more seriously, I want this issue about tariffs. I mean, such a boring word. You know, what is a tariff? if they were called taxes, then of course suddenly the public, do you think they would take more interest? I mean, it's come up in the debate in the sense that this will put up your prices for your goods, but it's never quite clear who actually pays this tax. And therefore and Trump could say, well, it's a tax on the foreigners and they're trying to rip us off, sort of thing. So it's a tax without an owner. Could the political system shift that a bit and people work out just who is being taxed? Because we know who it is.
No, thank you very much. In fact, how tariffs have been communicated, defined, and also visualized has changed quite a bit over the years. So in the Edwardian campaign, you have cartoons put out before election time, which show sort of one that immediately comes to mind is sort of a man with a top hat standing in front of a shop window, and one side of the shop window is clothing items, so gloves and hats and jackets and shoes with prices written, and then it says, you know, price made in Germany, and then on the other side you have the same goods made in Britain, and then you have the prices next to the items and cross through before and after tariffs. So in a way illustrating your point that it's a tax that the consumer pays eventually. In the popular campaign, tariffs were often just called food tax. So, I mean, corn laws in a way are that. But I think it links up with the point that Fox made, is that before the First World War, Britain is literally unilateral, a genuine unilateral free trade country. So it doesn't have all these agreements. And one argument against these agreements is once you start these agreements, you end up with ever more agreements. There are economic historians who calculated the potential benefit Britain could have had in the Victorian era, when it was such a big market for foreign goods, if they had used their market power to negotiate preferable access to foreign markets. So strictly speaking, that would have been possible. But the free trade argument is once you start that, it's a slippery slope. It's unstoppable to get it. So I think my one point to you is that historically, from what you described, it's almost inconceivable now that the country would just say, oh, we don't mess with all these agreements. We just have an open door policy. Just if you don't want to treat us nicely, that's your.
Well, we're the nearest to that. This country is probably the nearest to that. But one, right? We levy the least tariffs than most countries.
Well, some Brexit supporters had this idea in a way of returning to a unilateral.
Well, we had that
open
debate in the
door
Commons
policy.
on Thursday. If anybody wants to come in the gallery, we're discussing constitutions. Can I just come back on the point? Looking at the Trump tariffs, the kind of lazy response was it'll all get passed on to the consumer, which didn't happen. So the cost, if you say you've got a raw material that costs up, that increases the cost of production. Some of the depending on the product, some of that could be lost in margin on sales. So in other words, the shareholder bought some of that, or the owner. Some of it is inefficiency, which means the employees probably caught. Yeah, you know, there's fewer of them, or they're made to work harder. And then some of it went to the consumer. So it rather depends on the product. It rather depends on the flexibility within the margins and the production process. But it didn't all go to the consumer, which is one of the reasons Trump got off it, because everybody was saying, "Oh, well, it's great." I mean, cost of living has gone up substantially in the United States, and tariffs were clearly part of that. But there's a whole bunch of other things going on within the United States pushing that up, not least health care.
Oh, yeah. It's on. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was going to ask about imperial preference because it wasn't that part of the Joe Chamberlain idea that within the British Empire, as it then was, you got some sort of preferential treatment. And when did that into the 1930s when they started to increase tariffs generally? Was that still around or had disappeared?
No, indeed. I mean, the idea was effectively that you have sort of three zones. You have the British Isles, then you have a preferential agreements with the Dominions and India, and then you have higher tariffs and retaliation if necessary on non-imperial countries. So that was the plan. Already at that time, there was a complicated issue, particularly concerning India. India would have been quite seriously hurt by even this preferential access would have been low-level tariffs. After 1931, with the introduction of the general tariff, Britain does start negotiating bilateral arrangements, both with some countries that aren't part of the empires, Denmark and Argentina, but also with the dominions and colleagues who had German say Sitzfleisch, but more resilience and patience to work through all this complicated data of ultimately not very substantial agreements. I've reached the conclusion that surprisingly Britain got very little from that in the 1930s. The great hope was now we're doing what Chamberlain did, and in the climate of the 1930s, this was create additional markets. But even though it was still, formidable economic power, Britain got remarkably little out of these negotiations.
Okay, I'll take one more from the back of the group, and then I'll move on to an online one. Support free trade. That free trade does.
Well, that's what all those non-tariff barriers are all about. They're all about. A CBAM is a great example of that. Carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is just coming in, using in India, the India-UK trade deal, for example. CBAMs was excluded. But if we were properly accounting for the carbon that was used in order to make something, then something like CBAMs need to be put in. Similarly, you're not just exporting costs, you're exporting possible hardship, that at its very worst, labor conditions. That's why things like ILO stuff gets written into trade deals. I think you're right. In a straightforward, we'll buy your stuff from there rather than buy it from here without all the economic. That's how come the non-tariff barrier world, I think, has mushroomed because of the desire to level the playing field. But as I hope I tried to illustrate, it's a blooming complicated playing field with an awful lot of humps and bumps on it, and is not often successful in really then playing.
No, it's very interesting, very interesting. The question and also the way you responded, the way that the playing field idea, that was really developed by national liberal economists like Friedrich List in the early 19th century. I mean, the argument was that yes, on paper, what Smith wrote in the Wealth of Nations looks very nice, but it ignored that the countries that meet in trade or in a bargaining situation are never or rarely on a level playing field. So yes, free trade might work very well for Britain, but what about latecomers who want to develop? They need to be sort of insulated or given a sort of helpful hand by the state, so that the uneven playing field sort of leveled out. I mean, that was the criticism. I think free traders in the 19th century would have said, well, fair enough, but nonetheless, if we open our door to your exports and we allow other countries to enter our country, the competition will effectively lead to development in those countries. And I think economists would look at globalization and say, look at China. You know, what good would it have China have done if we had said, oh no, labor conditions, we just block exports from China. So it's comparative, I mean, obviously they have users.
Well, there are
not
some
naive.
there's some extreme elements of labour policy in China.
So
That's
sweatshop,
many of us find that are absolutely acceptable, which should colour the relationship with the company, doesn't it?
But the liberal idea is, of course, that the competitive process and markets will make sure, I mean, that's what Ricardo would have said, will make sure that even though there are inequalities in living standards, that through competition and open access to markets, developing countries will improve their standard of living. I mean, question is about the abuses, how you build that in. I think
the other issue,
the WTO, I mean, I think one reason why the WTO lost so much popular support is that it came to stand for the exploitative negative side effects of globalization. So we think of the Seattle protest.
I mean, just CBAM is a very good example. Carbon in the country like the United Kingdom has already emitted thousands, billions of tons of carbon, but at the moment we're going to treat the developing countries' carbon with exact same rule that our carbon is, and in a sense, we talk about catch up. So there is an argument. So well, we should do about that bit of carbon so that we can bring ourselves up. You've had it for hundreds of years. So that's in a sense, I mean, it just further complicates things, and it isn't fair. It's a cry that lots of people can make with some justification.
Duncan.
Yeah, it's quite a specific question from Daniel Woolston. There's a reasonably long-standing opposition to free ports need to be nuanced. Recognition need to stand free trade of port city economies.
The contemporary meaning of a free port, which is what was being instigated by the Boris government and others, is not, I think, what we would call a free port. It's essentially a development zone whereby a number of taxes are waived in order to create development. The arguments against them are twofold. Well, many, but twofold. One is they simply honeypot stuff that's going to happen anyway and reduce the government tax take on it. And secondly, there is quite a strong evidence that there's quite the way in which the taxation is policed within those free port systems it's a haven for money laundering in general, all that skullduggery. So we've been opposed on it. I think the idea, if you're in transit and you're moving stuff from one country to another, we're merely the point in between. I think there's measures that you can use so that we're not inhibiting that kind of trade. And of course, there are arguments that people getting refunds on their VAT if they're holiday makers on things they buy in this country, which is not exactly a free port issue, but it's an issue that the shops have been screaming about for many years because they feel it's meant that they're being undercut by France and other places where you can do that. So that's a digression, but free ports in general, not what Boris had in mind.
Okay, and are there any more questions?
Thanks very much. Really interesting discussion. I guess one of the things that's always interested me about this sort of Trump position is that it's never been 100% clear whether Trump is in fact pitching as a free trader using tariffs as the great threat to enforce, non-tariffs, effectively, free trade and the US to be able to have access to China, etc., or whether Trump wants a Chamberlain style ends to free trade. I still don't think, even with Witkoff and others, that strategy is absolutely clear. I mean, you can read stuff that makes it sound like they really want full free trade. It's only really about a punishment for non-free trade to the Chinese, etc. But my question is, you mentioned it, Lord Fox, that the earlier part of the liberal commitment to free trade came during a time of the gold standard, and then there's also the point that it also came during a time when Britain's the centre of the global economy. I want to know whether you think that in an era when we don't have a gold standard and we don't even have a dollar standard, and the accusation has often been, rightly or wrongly, that the Chinese have been depressing the value of their currency, etc., from the crowd that now advise Trump, and that previously that party listened to him. Even Mitt Romney was saying 8 years ago. Do you think it's possible to have a populist or a sort of popular free trade crowd, like in a democracy, when you have countries, I suppose, manipulating currencies, or maybe that's too strong, but when you don't have a sort of, people like, a totally fair playing field or level playing field on currency level?
I'll just take the first. Yeah, you can leave the difficult bit. Leave the difficult bit for you. Now, as all of you know, it seems impossible to predict what Trump does next. But I think one thing where he has been very, very consistent all the way back to when he was in New York is the issue of protection and tariffs. He took out whole page newspaper ads when he was still in real estate, angry about what international trade was doing to American jobs, and calling for sort of retaliation on tariffs. So I do think the one constant element is just a very basic, intuitive view he has, that which is that it's not mutual benefit. Trade is one person wins and another country loses. So that's how it is. And I think that also underpins a lot of this deal making rhetoric and fantasy, is that it's not possible to come up with multilateralism. Doesn't work because that is based on the idea that everyone can win. But that's not a good deal for Trump. I win, someone else has to lose. That's just as important. So I think that would be my one observation. And just briefly about to what degree sort of monetary policy and currency and things like that affect matters. I would say the one thing I learned when I sort of did research in what we call primary sources, papers, memoranda, and so forth, in the Edwardian debate, was that Alfred Marshall, the doyen of economics, probably the most respected economist at the time, he actually was asked by Balfour to write a memorandum in which he would dissect the different tariff proposals and argue it through to give the authoritative economic position informed with knowledge of the economy. And it became quite a long memorandum, and supposedly no one ever looked at it. Boy, people found it politically completely useless. And so it ended up behind a filing cabinet in the cabinet office, basically unread and hardly used at all in the campaign. And I mention that because I think one shouldn't make the mistake that popular politics, to be successful, necessarily has to be informed or in tune with the complexity of the economy. There were lots of things being said on both sides, the Chamberlain side, but also, the liberal side, which, strictly speaking, didn't stand up to proper economic analysis. And as you know, people these days, they walk around with notions about inflation which are completely exaggerated and wrong. So I think we have to accept that people carry ideas about the economy, and we're not going to clarify all of them can have, I think, successful campaign by that would be my pitch, by perhaps stressing more the political consequences of economic policy. So making the point, tariffs isn't, I mean, it's all about all those things that you laid out, which are hugely complex and technical. But it's also, I think, about the state of democracy and the relationship of citizens to governments and to business. And so I would, you know, I think it doesn't matter for popular politics. It doesn't matter that much what the currency of
You approve of it? No. I'm just on the Trump. I mean, I think his objective, anything in hand on to in his terms with because it is a zero-sum game as far as it's concerned. And I think there are all sorts of other things going on as well as narratives, financial coercion, undertransport system. There's the need for them to resist a de-dollarization. Essentially, dollarize the global economy, and then there's this almost uncontrollable crypto, which Trump has bred, not least for personal gain, which starts to disintermediate state banks. So the real danger of crypto, whether it's a safe or not, is essentially it removes monetary policy from the bank. It is hugely dangerous, and it's not accidental. So as far as policy goes, well, yeah, there is always a trade-off between what's real and what. You know, it's important to tell the truth. Question very technical. And it is important to try to find a way of describing something like in a way that is essentially right. When I studied chemistry, I studied a thing called molecular orbital theory. And molecular orbital theory is what holds it all together. And each year, from my first O-level right through to my last year at University College, I was taught a new upgraded version of molecular orbital. Each theory was an approximation, and each approximation was more accurate as my brain got more capable of understanding things like quantum. And in a sense, we have to choose the right molecular theory to communicate the important things about the economy. And that's what people need to understand about.
It wasn't as advanced or sophisticated the model, but that was what the cheap loaf was about, really. I mean, it managed to communicate a whole bundle of things about the economy and Britain's place in the world, all the way from the price of food to international relations. And people used it. I mean, you mentioned song sheets. I mean, through a variety of media, the song sheets, you had traveling troops acting out what a trade war would be with Uncle Sam and so forth. So, you know, the loaf was really important. And the closest I can think of in terms of communicating the economy in more recent times was, or would be Margaret Thatcher's embrace of the supermarket trolley, in which she said, this is basically will be the benefit from Europe. So
Well,
that was
she also
people understand that.
And she also kind of equated that with
Yeah, but that's more dangerous.
Which was very wrong.
Yeah. No. That is Germans are very good at that, actually. Household budgets. Yeah.
the point's been made about song sheets. And possibly this is a point of information, but I can think of two songs that relate to protection and free trade. The first from against the Chamberlain campaign. I won't sing it, but tariff reform means work for all, work for all, work for all. Tariff reform means work for all, chopping up wood in the works. And then in the later period, to the tune of "Yes, we have no bananas," I can only do the first line. "No, we don't want protection."
I worked at Tate and Lyle, and I was the custodian of the archive of all of the campaign of Tate Not State, which was Tate and Lyle's spirited, very right-wing defense against nationalization. It had songs, it had games, it had plays, go around women's institutes and village institutes and all sorts of things. I think we've lost the fun out of campaigning.
Hi, does the panel think that the role of reserve currencies across the world, say the dollar, euro, pound sterling, yen, etc., undermine the case for free trade, since countries, instead of selling their goods to other countries in order to buy other goods, often use it to accumulate foreign capital, say by having a giant trade surplus, and that has had certain negative impacts on their local economies and democracy. It was something that the liberal economist J.A. Hobson was railing against in the early 20th century's book Imperialism.
I'm just very brief and repeat what you rightly emphasized earlier, that of course the golden era of free trade, as far as Britain was concerned, was also the era of the gold standard, where you couldn't, you precisely couldn't do that, and the enormous conflicts that went into the decision to return to the gold standard under Churchill, a bit older now, and with a different party from painting downstairs.
Yes.
Was, at what rate do you go back to the dollar? And that decision caused enormous controversy precisely for this reason. So I think yes, there is a problem.
I deliberately mentioned the gold standard because it's exactly that point. I also said about flexible exchange rates, large and volatile capital flows, complex value chains. All of those things make it far harder to work out who's winning. The whole idea is it should be neutral, but is it if one currency is dominating another or whatever? So your point is well made, and the answer is it's another one of the many complications.
Whether he's aware of it or not, Trump focuses almost entirely on physical trade. Doesn't seem to notice the service sector or any of the other capital transfers that are going on.
In the recent PMQs, I think that they brought up Carney and Macron recently in standing up to Trump. Both Carney and Macron are both seemingly taking a little bit more of a closer stance to China. Carney recently traveling over there. Macron, I think, at Davos calling for more Chinese investment in the EU. Given the current party's stance on China, is there a bit of a risk that Davis may be overreaching, or how to actually gamble on actually the two biggest economies? Because they both seem to have different ways of dealing with free trade. One with tariffs and one with actually different ways of dealing with it, like China with not necessarily dealing with tariffs, but it's currency manipulation, and he's kind of picking a poison there.
Well, of course, Starmer's heading to China in a very few days. And my bet is he'll come back with a car factory and or a battery factory in his back pocket and claim it to be a great economic win. It would be better if he came back with Jimmy Lai in the adjacent seat with him. That would be a win. But I don't think there was a risk on Ed's part. I mean, I leaned heavily on the Carney imagery because he's right. And in a, I mean, the hardest thing to take in the Carney imagery is that we might be a middle power rather than a great power. And I think that's something that we probably have to come to terms. I amused that a Canadian colleague that I was talking to a couple of days ago when I said that Canada feels that sense of Britain's history or being lauded over them. So it was quite interesting. I think the relationship, I mean, to be more, the relationship with China is hugely complex because the pragmatic point is that having done what I said with competition policy, and he said it's Adam Smith's, you know, we keep getting the best person to make a pin. In the end, the pin is being made in Cheswan province and not in Macclesfield or Swindon. And we rely, I'll give you an example, magnets. Almost all the world's magnets are made in one province, China. One car, it has hundreds of thousands of magnets. That's just one example. So we have allowed the supply chain become so dependent for even never mind sophisticated chips and stuff like that. We're talking about magnets, bolts, and screws. During the COVID crisis, we were able to make the vaccine. What we didn't have was the capacity to make the little bottles to put the vaccine in. That kind of process that says that you can't disengage, you can't say, well, we're not going to do China, we'll stop doing China, because it would put everything to a standstill. The question is, how do you work with the Canadas? How do you work with the Frances? How do you work with the Norwegians? How do you work with the Japanese, whatever, to produce a over time key supply chains that we want to have within a political group that we feel we have more values in common. So there is no, and Arthur might well be dead before that's done, because you are talking about eights of capability.
You should also remember that the Chinese Communist Party has a long memory about the British participation in the Opium War of the 19th century. If you look at the brief history of the Communist Party that's on the website, it's all about how Britain was exploiting China. Go around, come to them. Right. I can make well that. Fine. Say thank you to both our speakers. Thank you again for your questions. And if anybody wants to do any transactions, either at the back or group with Paul or Duncan, please come see us at the end of the meeting. So if I could ask you to give us another round of applause for our speakers.